Good morning, everybody. How's it going? I hope you're all really well. Yeah, there we go. Well, feeling really tired, so I might just read the book. Because as I was prepping this week, like 4 weeks ago, I was reading through the chapter and I was kind of just overwhelmed with the poetry and the beauty of I was like highlighting the things that I wanted to focus on. So most of it's highlighted. I thought, well, why don't I just read it? But I guess that's frowned upon. So we have been, for those of us who haven't been here for the last few weeks, we've been journeying through a new series called Ancient Paths, where we're basically diving into genuine, historical, orthodox Christian faith, trying to go back a few centuries to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century and hear all the voices from there and hear those voices and how they have shaped our faith so far. So often in the world that we live in the chaos of life, it's easy to get caught up, and it's easy to kind of rewrite, I think, faith in light of how we live and how we act and how we respond to things today. So it's important every now and again just to stop and just to look back and to try and realize that as a community of faith, we have thousands of years worth of history and thousands of years worth of voices informing who we are and what we believe. And some of those voices have been great and some of them have been not so great. And we have to navigate all of that. But despite whether they were good or bad, all of them come together and represent a journey for us as Christians. Why do we believe what we believe? If we were to navigate some of the things that we've been talking about previously, how would you begin to interact and understand those things? We started on the first week with the idea of God as mystery, which is a strange thing in kind of the modern age to actually uphold mystery as an actual quality that we really respect and admire and something that we want to dive into. I think it's probably one of the hardest things for us to engage with. We love certainty. We love being able to definitively prove things are real and things exist. In fact, there's a whole strain of Christianity who are obsessed with proving how legitimate and authentic and provable it really is. But I think the more that you read the Bible, the more confused you actually get. And so God as mystery is not a way of just abdicating from the argument, but it's a way of realizing that actually mystery is our pathway into encounter and experience, to actually realize, me understanding it isn't the epitome of what I'm trying to go for here. It's actually to allow myself to navigate the uncertainties of life with a posture of allowing God to form me in the middle of that. And the second week we jumped to God as Trinity. So we engaged in some basic maths. We're going to continue that today. 3 equals 1. We have the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, but just one God, and how that makes sense. And I tried to explain that by distracting with a whole bunch of other things so that by the time we finished, you didn't realize I hadn't actually answered the question. And I think I did that well. But then I just highlighted it to you, so now I'm back to square one. But the whole idea of the Trinity is that we exist and we are the product of a God who is relationship and is love. And the relationship between the Father and the Son and the Spirit is so dynamically loving and so dynamically relational that we are called to dance that dance. We use the word perichoresis to describe the kind of dance and relationship that exists there. And whilst it's strange and confusing, we are caught up in that as people of faith, and we live as if we were dancing in the Trinity with the same kind of love there, and how to hold diversity in the midst of that. And last week, Jared dived into the depths of God as creator and all that meant and all of that. And that's a confusing conversation to have, I think, because when, as Christians, we talk about creation, a lot of people dive into a whole bunch of other conversations. But the real conversation when we talk about God as creator and we talk about creation is who is God and who is God in the beginning. Because in the middle of that conversation, we find a real image of who we are as well. And so as we journey today, we're going to be talking about God as man, God as human. And you think it should be easy because, well, God is human. Jesus Christ, came and walked the earth and we worship him and we understand him. But I just want to introduce our second problematic equation, is that we have this understanding of Jesus Christ as a man who was fully man and fully God, right? The common language. 100% God, 100% human, and that makes sense. Yeah? So I'm trying to not be too problematic, but there's so many things in our dialogue, so many things in our common language, so many cliches that we have that aren't necessarily wrong, but aren't necessarily explored. And so when we say that God is fully man and fully human, that's highly problematic. And I think we are comfortable a lot of the time in life with either one or the other, but when you put them together, it becomes rather disruptive. And so hopefully by the end of today, we'll be completely disrupted. And we'll be able to go back to God as mystery and go, oh, it's okay though, because he's mystery. So what we're dealing with, and I just want to frame it this morning with a first passage of Scripture, which is a beautiful hymn, a beautiful song that Paul gives us in Philippians, which describes the disruption of understanding God and the movement of God becoming a man. Because, I don't know, have you ever... I'm going to use a few movie analogies. I apologize, but have you ever seen Bruce Almighty? Yeah. Awesome movie, right? Maybe not. But I love Bruce Almighty. One of the questions asked in that movie is, if you were God with all the power, that God has, would you give it up? Would you give it up easily? That's the human question. It's like, whoa, what could you do if you were God? And Jim Carrey spends the first kind of 20 minutes of being God, causing disruption and doing the things that most of us would probably do if we were God. But the question here is, if you were God and you bore the image of God, the power, the almighty what would you do with that? Well, this is what God does with it. It says in Philippians 2, speaking of Jesus, who being in the very nature God, there's that 100% God, fully God, right? He bore the power, the might, the strength, the authority of God himself, but he didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. You have this image of God descending into our story, into our experience, but not just as a farce, as an image, as a hallucination. It wasn't simply God making himself manifest in a way that looks human but is really God. It's a way of actually allowing God to step into the story, and he incarnates himself. The word that we use to describe this is the incarnation. The God becoming flesh, God becoming man. And again, a lot of this language is very common. But as we journey through, we're going to try and picture what God becoming human means for us as humans. I think most of it was summed up, to be honest, in Linda's communion talk, with that beautiful phrase. How can we begin to understand the reality of Christ and how that begins to form us? It's profound. So rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Jared last week picked up on that story, from image to likeness, and that's where we're going to pick up today. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by being obedient to death, even death on a cross. So we'll finish today with the image of the cross and the problematic nature of the cross. And it seems like we always hit this, but it's profoundly important, because the paradox of proclaiming that Jesus is fully God and fully man really finds its climax in the reality that the man who was fully God and fully man dies a horrible death on the cross. And that in some way, by us looking at that image and the reality of Christ on the cross, we find a victory, a story of overcoming, a story of power, a story of hope. It doesn't look like hope, but it is. It doesn't look like victory, but it is. And so journeying through all of this and realizing how placing ourselves within the story of image and likeness really reveals to us the overcoming nature of suffering love. And so that's kind of where we're going, kind of giving you the whole thing, but whatever. Where we start is with these two people, Christ and Jesus. Because for us to begin to realize the power of fully God and fully man, we need to be honest about which one we're most comfortable with. And there's been a myriad of different interpretations and understanding of who Jesus actually is. And I want to ask you the question, is who are you most comfortable with? Are you most comfortable with Christ, which is the word that often symbolizes God's power, God's authority, the anointed one, the king, the ruler, the one who has all of the power, the fully God aspect of our Savior? Or are you more comfortable with Jesus, the raw, gritty, human, first century Palestinian Jew who literally walked to the earth? Because I think when we begin to talk about these two characters, and there's a lot of people who have separated out these two characters in history, we begin to find that we identify with either one or the other. We either identify with Jesus from above, from this narrative of power and strength and authority, and we find much more comfort in the fact that he's God, right? He can do all things. He's almighty. He can break through, overcome, fill you with power, like all that sort of stuff, right? And none of that is untrue. But it becomes really difficult for us to engage with Jesus as a human, as a man, as someone who actually lived and walked and breathed and suffered and experienced temptations and dealt with the same kind of struggles and raw intensity that we often deal with in life. And how do we actually identify with Jesus, knowing that he's God? Because a lot of the time it's really difficult, I find. Because what you can end up with is this kind of amalgamated picture of Jesus where, because he is God, all of the things that he struggled with and suffered with weren't really the same kind of struggles that we have. Because he could just deal with them, right? Because he was God. He couldn't really sin, right? I mean, I know he got tempted, but he couldn't really sin because he was God, right? And whilst he suffered, it's okay because he was God. He could overcome all of that, right? And so it becomes really disruptive to talk about God as a human, because when we begin to realize what that means for the person of Jesus, we begin to carry some rather problematic questions with us. I mean, could Jesus sin? Could he experience temptation and actually allow that temptation to overcome him? Could he battle with the same trauma that we battle with? Could he have been beaten? All of those sorts of things. Now, the victory is that he wasn't, so don't stone me or anything like that. But the question still remains, is that to engage in Orthodox Christianity, we need to realize who Jesus was, who he is, and therefore who we are, and how those things interconnect. Because it's essential for our faith, and it's essential for our salvation to realize that we don't separate God as man and God as human. Those are the same things. We don't separate God as Jesus is human and as God. Those two things aren't separate in our narrative. We don't have this story of a man who lived for about 33 years, but don't worry, now he's filled with power and he can serve us and serve our needs. What we realize is that these two stories both work together for the purposes of salvation, because without Jesus being fully God, he couldn't save us. There was no salvation possible because he was simply a man. But at the same time, the way Callistus Ware puts it in the book, salvation has to have reached the point of human need. It has to take on the form of true and authentic and beautiful humanity. Jesus has to have experienced everything that we experience in terms of our suffering and our pain, because it's only through that experience that he could have brought healing, and we'll find that as we journey through. Does that make sense? Is we okay with that? Jared picked up the image of creation last week, and I think that's a really important place for us to just unpack a little bit more. I don't know if you remember, but the most vivid image I have is a rib cage being split. You remember that from last week? Yeah? Okay. It didn't actually happen, but Jared told the story of the Babylonian creation myths, basically, with the beginning of all creation starting in this story of extreme violence, this story of extreme kind of dominance and authority and oppression, subjugation of like the role of women and all that sort of stuff, and there's rib cages being split and guts kind of flying everywhere. Like in my head, I kind of had this visual thing going on. But the power of that story was to really realize and understand what it is like to talk about God's image. Because from the very beginning, if you read the Genesis narratives and you have the image of God, who is this kind of authoritarian, dominant, violent God, and you are made in his image and likeness, then what image and likeness stands at the core of who you are? This is the Pharaoh, this is the Babylonians, this was the Persians, this was the Greeks. The beginning of their story is this kind of excessive violence and domination. The gods were here, and humans were here. And so if you wanted to take on a form of power or authority, you had to raise yourself to here and embody this kind of violence. It was just catastrophic. the Genesis stories, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, which speaks of the Jewish creation, of the image of God at the beginning, tells such a radically different story. And it's so beautiful. And in the middle of that story, we find truly what it is to be made in his image. Because we don't have the image of a violent God. We don't have the image of a God whose power is found in authority and domination. We don't have the image of God who values men over women. We have a different story. We have the story of a God who looks around, and as he creates, he declares everything to be good. We have the story, and it's a strange story in the context of when it was written. We have the story of not just men, but also women being allowed into the image of God. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh is the Jewish way of saying there is equality in God's image for both men and for both women. And what we find is Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are powerful apologetics against the violence of the Babylonian creation stories. And what they're doing is they're reframing the whole thing to give us a picture of who God is. That God is good. That God is holy and righteous. And that in the midst of who he is, we find our image. And we move towards his likeness. See, the problem, and hear me well, hear me right. The problem with reading Genesis as a functionalist is that you miss the image of God. When you read Genesis as a how, you miss the image. And you miss Jesus. Because when we come to the New Testament and we have the Word becoming flesh, the Logos, the reality of God becoming a man, it becomes an interesting break in the story. If you've read Genesis and, in fact, Jewish history through the lens of function and the lens of how, when you get to Jesus, it's like, plan B. But when you begin to read Genesis and realize that the whole purpose of the Genesis story is to show us who God is, that he is good, and that our story begins with goodness, then we realize that the reality of the incarnation, the reality of Jesus Christ, is present from the very beginning, from Genesis 1. And that's one of the things that I want to make sure that we really understand today, is that Jesus didn't begin in the New Testament. That wasn't the New Testament plan. The plan started in Genesis. Jesus was present at the creation of all things. And he was always the plan. And we've got a few questions spinning off in our head, I'm sure, as to how can that be true, right? Because wasn't it all based on wasn't Jesus the reaction to the fall, right? Because a lot of us start our theology, whether we like it or not, at Genesis 3. We forget number 1, and we forget number 2. We start with Genesis 3. Because Genesis 3 is the story of a tragedy. But Genesis 3 is the story of that broken image. We had Raj and Rochelle breaking images and stuff last week, right? Genesis 3 is the beginning of the crack, the fragmentation, the broken image, right? And that's where we often start, and I hear people, and you can hear it in people's theology and their language when they start, well, we're just broken, we're just, there's nothing good about us, we're all kind of totally depraved, right? But what I want to do is I want to try and pull us back just 2 chapters. Because if we can, instead of starting our theology and starting our understanding of God with the fact that he is good and we are not, what we need to realize is that he is good and therefore we are good, right? But carrying those 2 things well and honestly. Because to say that we are good is not to be negligent about the brokenness that is in all of us, right? It's not to say don't worry about all the brokenness, because at the heart you're a good guy. It's to realize that yes, we all have those things in us, and I'm sure we all are thinking about them. We know what they are. We all have those broken things inside of our soul. But there's something powerful when we begin to retell the story in light of God's goodness, and the fact that the image and the likeness that we're trying to live out is the goodness of God, and we see that formed beautifully in Jesus. See, Christ is the true image and the true likeness. From the beginning, the incarnation is an integral part of God's vision. This is really important for us to grasp. Callista Ware says that the incarnation is not simply a way of undoing the effects of original sin, but it is an essential stage upon man's journey from the divine image to the divine likeness. Capturing our vision of God in light of Genesis 1 and 2 is to see the world through the lens of beauty, to see the world through the lens of truth, to realize that Adam and Eve had the potential for true goodness, the true image and the true likeness. And just as Jared, who was eating his apple last week, just as through that one man, brokenness seemed to enter the story, what we have now is the story of Jesus, who didn't just bear the potential for goodness, but is the expression of full goodness. And that image and that likeness is restored in his personhood. I was reading a book this week by a guy called Scott McKnight. Some of you have probably read Scott McKnight's books. He's really great. And he asked at the very beginning of the book, what is a Christian? It's a question that we're supposed to be able to answer, right? Just like that. What is a Christian? And he asked that question, and as he asked it, he said, this is the most important question we can ask. And so I was like, all right, I wonder how I would answer it. I asked myself the same question and started brainstorming a few things. What is a Christian? I wonder if you can answer that question. Like, what is a Christian? Are you a Christian? Maybe, some of you. And if you are, I hope, maybe, I don't know. Where am I? But if I was to ask you the question, like, what is it to follow Jesus? What is it to call yourself a Christian? And then he began to unpack the whole different strains of theology and the way people experienced and communicated their faith, and the whole narrative of salvation. And there was this one moment where I accepted Jesus into my heart, and it was a beautiful moment, all that sort of stuff. And then he said, well, here's what I think, which is good because that's why I was reading his book, to hear his thoughts. What is a Christian? A person that follows Jesus. I felt really disappointed. Right? I was hoping something really deep. And then I realized that is probably the deepest answer he could have given, because that was like the first page, and then he spends the rest of the book unpacking what it is to follow Jesus. But the reality of calling ourselves Christians and being part of this tribe we call Christianity is that we follow Jesus. But what are we following him into? And what, in following Jesus, does it mean for us? Because what we have in the person of Jesus is an image of true goodness and true beauty. And to follow Jesus is to follow him into that. And I'm going to give an example of how we begin to follow him into that. But this is critical for us. And it's, again, there's nothing profound here. This is orthodoxy. This is basic. This is exactly what we've always known, but maybe not fully experienced. Is that to follow Jesus is to carry him in the forefront of our minds and to follow him into the true image of goodness and beauty. So I just wanted to address that, because a lot of us, when we're thinking about what it is to be human, we think about brokenness. We think about sin. We think about pain. And we think that is an inescapable reality of being human, and maybe it is. But it's not the only story that's being told. It's not the only reality that we are a part of. And so, as we learn to follow Jesus, we learn how to tell the story of creation in a way that is still good and still beautiful and still true, but not as a simple exercise in nostalgia. We're not just looking back to Genesis 1 and going, I wish I could get back to that beautiful garden paradise. Because the other thing that Jesus does for us is he stops us from nostalgia and he points us onwards. He said that was good, but there's something else that's coming. There's something greater, something more beautiful. There's another garden and another reality and another paradise. And we are going to be part of creating that with him. We're going to be entering into that story. The incarnation is an invitation to share in God's self-giving love and to begin to move from image to likeness. Because in doing so, we discover what it is to be truly human. I have a problem, a pet hate, if you will, with a lot of things, actually. Every week we're discovering more as we journey together. Last time it was introversy. I was amazed, actually, how many people after last time I spoke, and I was really honest with you about how introverted I was, how many people came up and hugged me afterwards. I appreciate that. And it was amazing, the amount of people that hugged me and said, don't worry, I know exactly how you feel. I'm the same. I'm like, clearly not. But I do feel like I labored on that point a little bit much. I just want you to all know I do like you all. I love you. I just don't want you to feel insecure. I think some people went home and started crying and bawling their eyes out. But I have a problem. Have you ever heard phrases that frustrate you or annoy you? And one of them for me is, we're only human. Yeah? Isn't that a phrase? What do you usually say that? You usually say that after you stuff something up, right? I'm only human, right? Again, Genesis 3. Read Genesis 1 and read Genesis 2 and talk about beauty, talk about goodness, talk about God's vision, talk about God's power, talk about God creating all things and his vision for a paradise, and then say, I'm only human. And again, I'm not trying to elevate us as humans to the kind of the same place as God, but what I am trying to communicate is the inherent value we have as humans and as those that participate in this same kind of dance that God is involved with, the ones who are invited to experience God in ways that are truly good and truly beautiful. See, that's where we need to start. That's where we start. And we bear the brokenness along the way as a community. We deal with that. We respond to that. We care and we love. But we begin with goodness. We begin with beauty. Do you know how hard it is to assume the best of people? And it's funny, but I struggle. I set myself a challenge like ages ago. I just totally stuff it up all the time. To only assume the best, right? But we don't. There's this kind of reflexive thing inside of us that we always assume the worst, apart from us. My motives are always good, but yours are always bad. But it's really difficult for us, I think, to see the beauty in others, especially the ones we find challenging. But here is my challenge, is to learn to see the beauty in everything. Learn to see the beauty in each person that you come across, to assume the best. Because in doing that, we actually discover what it is to be human. And instead of saying, we're only human, we say, well, we're human. You're human. We bear this kind of humanity that God is working through us and in us, calling us back into this dance. And so I want to ask the question, I'm pivoting again off Jared last week. What does it mean to be made in the image and the likeness of God? Yes, Batman. I loved what Jared said about Batman last week. I didn't think he labored on it enough, because I just want to take a moment and talk about Batman. Is that okay? And hopefully it connects. If it doesn't, I'm talking about Batman. Who cares? It's awesome, right? I apologize if you haven't seen Batman. And I'm going to give you some spoilers, but I feel like if you haven't seen Batman, you're not a Batman fan, so spoilers aren't going to make a difference. Is that okay? No? Okay, fine. Whatever. I'm the one in the microphone. So Batman, specifically Jared last week, was drawing on the work of a particular philosopher called Slavoj Žižek, who he loves to watch movies and then write philosophy about them, which is really smart, but also really devastating, because you think a movie is great, and then you read his philosophy and the undertones of it, and you're like, wow, I didn't see that. I feel dumb, and now I hate the movie. But one of the most powerful reviews he ever did was of The Dark Knight. Okay, we have this beautiful story of Batman and the Joker, okay? And if you don't know the story, you should watch it, okay? I'm teaching a class at the end of July on, it's called Understanding Kingdom Ministry, and I emailed all my students and said, you need to watch The Dark Knight before you get to class, or you're not going to have a clue what's going on, right? Because I'm a good Bible college lecturer. And so, but what Zizek does in evaluating the Batman is to identify who is it that we find our point of identification with? Is it Batman? Is it Joker? Is it someone else going on there? And he begins to uncover a certain amount of myths and lies present within the story that keep us feeling safe and keep us feeling happy. For example, he talks about the reality of who Batman is. And Jared, this is what Jared mentioned last week, is, Batman is this kind of vigilante bringer of justice who goes around beating people up by night. But by day, he's the owner of this billion-dollar empire that funds money into the military. And so the people he's actually beating up at night were most likely created because of the systems of injustice that by day he's involved in with this kind of capitalist empire. So he's making the monsters, and then he's fighting the monsters and feeling great about fighting the monsters that he's created. That makes sense? You create poverty, people rise up from poverty and try and fight the systems that created all of this inequity and inequality, and then he's beating them up. Okay? Now, they're violent and they're horrific and all that sort of stuff. But the narrative is that by using violence, by using anger, by using aggression, he's winning the war. But the strangest thing, all of that, you can go, oh yeah, take it or leave it. But the fascinating thing is that he's the one that you identify with the most. Batman is the one that you love. Why? Why do you like Batman over, say, the Joker? Okay? I mean, a lot of people do love the Joker, and it's like the dark side, and inside of us, we're like, oh, I love that guy. But we never be open about it. But really, when you read Zizek, who isn't a Christian, but what he says is the only Christological figure in Batman is the Joker, which means the only Christ-like figure in Batman is the Joker, aside from all of the psychosis and violence. Because the Joker is the only one that realizes that in order to get to the heart of what society will truly look like, you need to take off the mask. You need to uncover the lie, the myth, the pretense that you have bought into. And so when you get to the very end of the movie, there's this figure, Harvey Dent, okay, annoying character. But he represents true goodness, right, in the city. He's what people pin their hopes on. And at some point in the movie, he loses half his face, and so he gets annoyed and starts killing people. And so Batman has this conversation with his mate at the very end, right? And they make a decision. They say, if the whole city has pinned their hopes on the goodness present within this guy, if they find out that he's bad, everything's going to crumble, and they're going to have no one to put their faith in. So they decide, instead of being honest about the fact that this guy was broken and he had struggles and he went a bit crazy, they decide to blame everything on the Batman and to elevate this guy as still the true hero that they wanted to be, right? And a lot of people have read that and gone, oh, that's such a sacrifice on Batman's behalf. Okay, he's the Christ in this movie. But the reality is that what that presents to us is the acknowledgement that society is built on the lie that goodness overlooks our brokenness. It subjugates and pushes our brokenness behind us. And as long as I can't see it, I'm comfortable with it. Okay? And we scapegoat the Batman, but we identify with him the most because we think that he's fighting for goodness. We think that he's fighting for truth, but he's not. He's not the hero that Gotham needs. He's the one perpetuating the cycle of mythic violence. And what we realize at the story is that society is far more comfortable to buy into the myth than they are to come to terms with the reality. And that's true of us. If you need any more proof, just look at Britain. Sorry. I can say that because I'm going on holiday in like an hour, and so Phil will field all the calls. Anyway, Zizek's interpretation of the film was prompted by the film's extraordinary popularity, which many people probably ascribe to the fact that it humanized the superhero. So here we find really the core of our struggle, is that we think that the reason we identify with these kind of characters in popular media is because they are human, right? He has the same kind of struggles that we have. He struggles with the same kind of things. He doesn't have goodness. It's the anti-hero, the rise of the anti-hero. I'm watching House of Cards at the minute. House of Cards, yeah? Great movie. But what I noticed about House of Cards, for those of you that have watched it, is there's literally no good character in the whole show, right? I'm searching for someone who represents true goodness, true nobility, true justice, and it's not there. And people that are watching, and I've got friends, I'm talking to people trying to who is the good guy in this whole thing? There is no good guy, because it's all about politicians. Sorry, I'll stop. But the whole thing is this story. And I was talking to someone that said, yeah, but doesn't it make it more real? Does it? Because it gives us a picture of life and humanity, totally depraved, void of all goodness. But that's what real life is like, right? No, it's not. No, it's not. See, the reason people identified with the Batman is because they think it represents some kind of real, true human. But it's not. See, to come to terms with our faith and to reframe this, if we can, back into the image of Christ, is to realize that true humanity is found not by plummeting into the depths of our struggles and brokenness, but by a man who overcame all of that. And as we follow him, we do the same. We don't put on a mask at night and try and take out our aggression by fighting justice in the same way that injustice is actually caused. What we do is we are honest about, first of all, our complicity in creating these problems in the first place. And then we engage in real Christian disciplines like honesty and confession and transparency. And we actually come face to face with our humanity, not so we can stay there and say, oh, I'm just human like everybody else. But we can step beyond that into the picture of what it is to be truly human in the image of Christ. Let's just pick up on how Kallistos Ware talks about this. He talks about the beauty and the pain of what it is to frame Jesus truly as a human. He said that is agony in the garden and that is crucifixion. The forces of darkness assail him with all of their violence, but, and here is where we find what true humanity looks like, but they cannot change his compassion into hatred. Do you know that the victory of the cross is that this kind of power is also available to us? This is what it is to be formed in God's image and to move into his likeness, is to realize that the same forces of darkness that assail us with violence cannot necessarily change our compassion into hatred unless we let them. They cannot prevent his love from continuing to be itself. His love is tested to the furthest point, but it is not overwhelmed. See, to be truly human is to walk in the humanity of Christ and realize that what he represented to us was not some kind of mystical illusion. He didn't overcome his sufferings because he was God. He overcame his sufferings because he was a man. And that's important. Because the moment you elevate his deity, his godliness, as a way of explaining how he could have overcome all of this sort of stuff, you rob him of his suffering. And you miss the whole point. Because in that context, when we come to the cross and say it's a victory, you won't understand. We won't understand the cross as the victory of suffering love over the forces of evil. We'll turn it into something else. But this is where we find what it is to walk in the image and in the likeness. Is to realize that the forces of darkness that assail us with violence, our response is not to assail them with violence, right? Our voice is not to hit back, but to realize that as we dance the dance of love, and it sounds cheesy, I know, but it's the way that we have to think about it. It's the way that we have to talk about it. The beginning of the last time I spoke, I talked about moving away from the systematic train of thinking and stepping into something that it gives us an image of a dance, an image of love, and this is exactly what it is. And our final image is the painful image of Christ in his true picture of humanity, in the deepest picture of both victory and tragedy that we have in the scriptures. Because what the cross represents is just so much pain and so much violence and so much tragedy, but also so much beauty. And it's weird to hold those things together. But what we realize is that at this point, when he's hanging on the cross, experiencing his humanity more than any of us probably have experienced ours, he cries out. And we find almost the last suffering that he experiences is a sense of disparity and separation. Just go back 2 weeks to understanding the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, that eternal dance, that kind of experience of self-giving mutual love, completely diverse yet completely unified. This is the fabric of all creation. imagine Christ on the cross, not only feeling this kind of hatred and aggression from us, but feeling separated from that which he has always known. Imagine that kind of void, that kind of suffering. But the beauty of this story, in the midst of this tragedy, is that he took on that pain and that suffering, that brokenness, that loneliness, that emptiness, so that he could heal it. And this is why the cross is a victory, because the cross represents for us complete healing. And the resurrection, and the way Callistus Ware talks about it, he said a lot of people are waiting for the resurrection. The cross is where it goes wrong, and the resurrection is where it goes right. But the cross is the victory, but we can't quite see it yet. And then through the resurrection, we see the victory that the cross actually represents, and we carry it at the heart of us. Because the cross is the true image and the true likeness of Christ, of God. And so we find ourselves oftentimes entering into moments like these, I think, feeling lonely, feeling empty, feeling completely void of anything, complete pain and complete chaos. And I understand that. Many of you understand that much more than me. But what we can be assured of in these moments is that Christ experienced it, but we don't just look at him as a human to go, oh, he understands. We look at him as a human to realize, oh, he healed that. We still experience pain, we still experience all that suffering, but it no longer overcomes us. It no longer has the power to completely dominate us and take authority over us. We now step into the victory, and it's not a victory that's always like, yeah, the victory. Sometimes it is, but most of the time, it's a quiet victory. It's a victory that says, at least I'm not dead today. And that's important. It is important to acknowledge that it's not always grand, this story. That the reality of a God who became a man is a strange, paradoxical image that allows us to really come to terms with ourselves, I think, but move beyond ourselves as well. And that's what I want. We'll finish with another piece of literature. It's actually a prayer that the Orthodox Church pray around, I think, on Christmas Day. And it really frames the ridiculous nature of having a God who became a man. I mean, I tell you what, for years and years, I have a relatively fundamentalist family. Not in a really negative way necessarily, but I find oftentimes the nature of fundamentalism is a desperate need to prove that something is real or that something is right, okay? We'll often say, within fundamentalism, that if I can prove it, I can bring people to Jesus, right? That's the purpose, right? But oftentimes it's not. It's so that I can prove it over and against you. But when it comes to proving that Jesus became a man, I look at everything, and oftentimes when we're talking about proving the reality of Christianity, people often ask me questions at college, like, what's different about Christianity than Islam, Buddhism, or Hinduism? I'm like, well, that's an interesting question. I'm glad you're here. A lot. But probably the most powerful image is go and search all the other world religions and find the beauty in all of them, but try and find a story of a God who pursues you, who comes down, enters into your story, speaks to you, calls you, allows you the freedom to make mistakes and move, but consistently calls you and forms you into his image. Find that God. We find it perfectly in the image of Jesus. A marvelous wonder has this day come to pass. Nature is made new and God becomes man. That which he was, he has remained, and that which he was not, he has taken upon himself, while suffering neither confusion nor division. How shall I tell of this great mystery? He who is without flesh becomes incarnate. The Word puts on a body, the invisible is seen. He whom no hand can touch is handled, and he who has no beginning now begins to be. The Son of God becomes the Son of Man. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Let's come together and pray. Lord, we thank you that what we hold at the core is that you are a mystery to us so often. But we continue to press in and we continue to press deeper because whilst you are a mystery, we still find such beauty in diving into the depths of our own understanding, of trying to allow the scriptures to speak to us, not just us speaking to them, and to allow the space for you to speak into our soul. And my prayer this morning is that we would capture a vision of what that image truly looks like, the image that is spoken of in the beginning, the image that is fulfilled in the person of Christ. And that instead of looking at ourselves and repackaging the image, we look first to your Son and we follow in his ways. And we allow true goodness and true beauty to fill us, to overwhelm us, and to become what spills out of us. We acknowledge, Lord, that we are broken so often. And that is our brokenness that so often leads to pain in other people's lives. And we confess that openly now. We are not satisfied to live under the illusion that all is well. We know that it's not. But far from being captured by despair, we realize that whilst all is not well, it is well with us because of who you are. And as we walk in your ways, we begin to step into that beautiful vision of a new world where hatred is replaced with love, where fear is replaced with love, where division and anger and prejudice is also replaced with love. And the love that we speak of is not simply an arbitrary cliche, but the love we speak of is a divine dance that we are now dancing as well. I pray that the images that we've carried with us for the last 4 weeks would settle deep inside of our soul and that they would continue to move us onwards. We pray in your mighty name. Amen.